Hello everyone, welcome to this week's Tech Tuesdays webinar on SCIM configuration on IICS admin. I'm Brinda, your host for today's session. And we have with us Sriram Shishadri, an Informatica veteran from the Customer Success Technologies team, handling cloud data warehouse and data lake journeys for customers, and he specializes in cloud data management solutions. Before we start this webinar, let's go through some housekeeping tips. The session is for 1 hour, that includes 15 minutes Q&A. You can post your queries in the Q&A box and we'll try and address them. Dial-in participants are muted for the entire session. The session is being recorded and will be available in the Informatica Support YouTube channel and the Success portal. You'll be able to download the slide deck from the Success portal. Please feel free to put in your feedbacks and suggestions for the session in the post-webinar survey. The Tech Tuesdays webinars are hosted within the Success portal, which is a microlearning platform that offers free and unlimited learning to all registered users. This feature-rich platform was launched to help you learn and use Informatica products better. Here are a few important links that you can go over later that will help you in your product adoption journey with Informatica. Over to you, Sriram. Thank you.
Hi all, thanks for joining this webinar. This is Sriram Shishadri here. And today we're going to be talking about one of our new features that we launched in our recent releases, which is user group provisioning with SCIM. Let's get started on that. All right. So what is SCIM, right? So SCIM is nothing but a system for cross-domain identity management, which is again an open standard that allows you for syncing identity information between your identity provider and your service provider, right? So who are these identity providers? So identity providers can be anyone from say octa or Azure AD, for example, and you can have service providers like Informatica itself, which is our ICDM platform, and any other cloud applications that you are using within your enterprise, right? Now, what is the advantage of using? What's the advantage of having SCIM as part of your enterprise SaaS applications, right? So you would have a central managed repository of your users and groups managed by an identity provider, which again could be Okta or Azure AD, for example. And you would have all your enterprise cloud SaaS applications integrate with the identity provider for two-way sync between the identity provider and the service provider for any CRUD operations on, say, the users or user groups or any other identity information, for example, right? So this kind of gives you a seamless way to sync between these two systems, and also you don't have to manage additionally or you don't have to do any kind of user management additionally in any of your cloud applications, for example, right? So this gives you an easier way to manage all your identities in your IDP side, which is the core expertise of that product, and have your enterprise SaaS applications like Informatica just consume that information, be in sync with the identity provider. And then once the identity information is present with Informatica, for example, you can then integrate that information for ACL or any kind of security permissions within the platform, right? So it's a seamless sync and integration between your identity provider and your service provider, so that you don't have to additionally create users, groups, or anything of that sort in your SaaS application. So that's the primary purpose of why we have SCIM implemented, and why it would be a very good scenario to have it in your enterprise SaaS product for user management. All right, go on to the next slide. Right. So as I mentioned earlier, right? So SCIM SCIM is basically a bunch of APIs that your service provider would implement, which again IICS in this case, and you will have your client, it could be Okta or Azure directly, for example, which would basically do CRUD operations on the send the CRUD operation request to the service provider for SCIM, right? And again, as I mentioned, the CRUD operations could be anything for users or groups or any other identity information, profiles, attributes, and so on and so forth. So what Informatica is doing here is implementing those the API calls that you would receive from the SCIM client, and then sending the response back to the identity provider. So so that's the visualization of how the sync works. And these are the different APIs that Informatica supports at this point as a platform. So as you could see, we could do CRUD operations on the users and group, and we can also do bulk updates for again our users, for example. And the other information is more so for the SCIM client, which could be a bunch of get operations that we support for config and other metadata, right? So these are the APIs that we support at this point from the Informatica platform. Right. So how do you enable this option in the IICS platform, right? So you would go into your administrator console once you log into IICS, and then once you click on SAML setup in the list of options, you would see this checkbox here which says enable IDP to push users and groups using SCIM 2.0, right? So once you've enabled this, and that's when you can go ahead and start, you can go ahead and configure the SCIM provisioning in your IDP side, and also do some group mapping on the Informatica side. So we will see the complete end-to-end flow of enabling this in both IDP and Informatica side to have a seamless sync between these two systems, right? But yeah, this is the starting point for you to enable SCIM in the admin console. And then once you enable, you'll obviously get this SCIM token, which you could copy. We would then use this token to configure the provisioning in your IDP side, right? So you can just copy paste this token to start with, and then once you have the token, we'll get onto the IDP side and then configure the app and the provisioning from the identity provider, right? And then what happens is once you have a new user created, for example, in your IDP side, and then you have synced it with the application, that user will be shown as pending activation in Informatica side. So once the user logs in for the first time, the pending activation will automatically change to active, and then you would have your users log into the IICS platform, right? And then we do have a set interval when the SCIM client updates or deletes, for example, are sent in IICS. And then they're all sent to the IICS SCIM endpoint, right? So I will also go over the actual SCIM service URL which you would configure in the IDP side. But for now, just information on what are the different attributes that you would need to get started with, right? So the first thing is obviously enabling, as I mentioned, in the admin console, and then keeping the token and the SCIM URL handy for you to go and configure in the IDP side. And then we also have a dedicated doc for Azure Active Directory and Okta, going step by step on how we would configure this. We would be looking at Okta today as part of this webinar, but you can also find the same doc that's available for Azure Directory in our doc site, right? So pretty much it's just the tool, it's just a way of configuring that's different between these two tools, but at a fundamental point, the core concepts remain the same, right? So you would basically get use the token, create an app and provision the groups to be pushed into IICS from either of these tools, and then you can also sync users, for example, to Informatica, right? So the concepts are going to be the same. It's just how you would do as part of the tool would be the only difference, right? So we'll be jumping onto the demo right now, where we go step by step on how you would configure this. And I'll be using Okta again for this demo, but again, the principles would be the same for any other SCIM 2.0 protocol supported tool, right? So let's jump onto the demo. And I'll start sharing my browser for that. Hope you can see my screen right now. So the first thing that you would do, as I mentioned during my presentation, is you would go ahead and enable the IDP to push users in groups, and then you would basically get an existing token. So because I've already configured, it's asking if I want to override. But if you're not configured, it will basically give you a token that you can copy and use it in your IDP side, right? So so as I mentioned, the SAML setup is where you would actually configure everything that's related to the SCIM and the SAML group mapping and the attribute mapping and so on. But let's first go ahead and create the configuration in the IDP side. and then we'll come back to IICS to configure the other attributes, right? So once you go back to Okta and then go to applications and click on new applications, this is the screen that you would basically see. You would first give in the app name, whatever you want to give for your IICS app. This could be IICS Dev, could be IICS QA or Prod or whatever your business unit wants to name the IICS org. You can give it an app name, and then and then once you click on next, this is where you would actually configure the SAML settings, right? So the first step is you would first configure all the settings here in Okta, and then you would go and configure the metadata once Okta generates the metadata file in IICS. The first step always is you always create an application in Okta first, and then use that information in IICS, right? So once you come to this page, you will see that there are about 3 URLs that are really required for setting up SAML and Okta, right? So if you look at this URL, this is pretty much in a standard format where it's informaticacloud.com/identity service, and then you will see this specific ID here, which is actually the org ID, right? So the format of these 3 URLs, again, it's available in the doc site. So all you need to do is pick it up from the doc site, and then just change the org ID to your specific org ID, right? And then the same way for the audience URI, this will get automatically populated. It's the other audience URI that you would see here is it's the org-id.dm-us.informaticacloud.com, right? So these two are the major URLs that you would need, and you would just pick up the format from the doc side and then change the org ID to your own org ID, right? So that's the second step for configuring the SAML. And then obviously for the name ID format, you can give the email address. The other major configuration that you need to do here is the group attribute, right? So in your Okta directory, in your Okta profile, you would have the attribute that holds the group information, right? It could be, again, multiple groups for a specific user, and then you'll have to just pass on this group attribute to the SAML response, right? So that's the attribute that you would give here, and this just says that whatever group information is present in the profile, just send it back as a response. You can also kind of limit on what groups need to be sent back to the SAML response if required, but we can basically consume all the groups that are available for that user back to the column, right? So this is what we would consume for our group sync between IDP and IICS, right? So once this is done, the group settings is done, you would click on next, and then you would this page is okay, so you'd go click on finish, and then you would see something called as an identity provided metadata that Okta will generate, right? So if you actually open this, you will see an XML file. You will actually download this XML file, and then once you have the XML file, you can actually drop it here in the SAML setup page. This is a file that you would use. Once you drop it, you would actually get all these values automatically populated based on what you configured here, right? So that's the quick summary on how you would generally create a SAML setup. We will concentrate more on the SCIM setup here, but this is just a quick summary on how you would go about doing the SAML setup, right? So first go to Okta, set up the app, you'll create an application, use the URL format to change the org ID, and then once you've set up the org ID, the audience entity URL and so on, you would basically have the apps set up in Okta side, right? Download the metadata from this link here, and then you can go ahead and drop the metadata file, which will auto-populate all these information for you, right? So that's a quick summary on how you would set up SAML for authentication, right? To start with. Now, the next thing that you would do is once that's set up, as I told you, you would have you have to enable IDP to push users groups using SCIM 2.0, and then you would get a token that you would use for your Okta provisioning for SCIM, right? So the second step would be to basically enable this checkbox here and click on generate token. which you would then use for your SCIM configuration, right? And then the next thing that you would do is go back to Okta and then click on applications. And then if you go to the application that you just created, you would see something called as the app settings. You just go click on edit and enable SCIM provisioning, right? So once this checkbox is enabled, you'll automatically see this tab called provisioning, right? So the app that you just created for your SAML setup, come back to the general settings here and enable the SCIM provisioning. And then once this is enabled, you will have the provisioning tab come up here, right? And then once you click on provisioning, this is where you'll start setting up the sync between IDP and the service provider, right? So the first thing that you would do is go to provisioning, and then you would basically edit the push new users profile updates and then push groups, right? And this is where you will actually use the token that you downloaded from, that you copied from your admin console, right? So click on the generate token here, and then copy that token here with the auth mode as HTTP header. So once this is done, you will basically have your provisioning set up in your Okta site. So I think it's trying to, yeah, all right. So now this is done. And then the next thing that you would do is if you come back here, you'll basically enable what are the different operations that you want to sync between Okta and your app, right? So that's what it clearly says. So you basically enable create users, update user attributes, and then deactivate users. These are the different operations that we support, as we saw in the presentation earlier, right? And then for Okta, I don't think you'll have to set up anything. You can just click on save in the provisioning app, right? So that's the next step that you would do. Come to the provisioning tab here, configure the token, and then configure the Okta to IICS sync that you would do here for different functions that you see, right? And then once this is done, what you need to do is, as a next step, you'll have to map the user attributes for IICS, right? So there are a bunch of attributes that you have to map from Okta site that IICS requires for setting up the profile in the platform. So for that, you just go to directory, go to profile editor, and then once you go to profile editor, you'll actually see the user that's created for that app. And then you'll have to click on mappings here. So these are the different mappings that you will have to send to IICS. So first, let's look at this tab where it's Okta to IICS, right? So you would have a bunch of different Okta user attributes like user dot first name, last name, and so on. You would basically, pick the actual attributes from the drop down here, and then sync it with the IICS app site, right? So how did we get this information? Basically, once we gave the SCIM credentials, SCIM token, we basically were able to pull all the different attributes here, right? So this whole list is again available in the doc site. You would do the profile mapping for both Okta to IICS and for IICS to Okta, right? So there's like a final list of mappings that's required, that's available in the doc site, which you can just follow and add the mappings here. One more piece of information that I want to share is, let's get back to the provisioning app. So the other information I want to share is, this is the URL that you would configure for the SCIM service for Okta to send the request to the service providers, right? So it's basically your base login domain / SCIM happen service, right? So this is something that you could use, and this is the token that you would copy from the admin console, right? So first step is configuring this, setting up the provisioning, and then we spoke about the profile editor where you would configure the mappings for that specific application you would set up both ways for both IICS to Okta and Okta to IICS, and then the complete list of mappings is there in the doc side, so you could just follow the list because it's a pretty large list, so it wouldn't be the best use of time to go over each of these drop-downs, but it's pretty straightforward. It's just telling what user attributes you have to use for the specific attribute in IICS side. So that's pretty much what you're setting up here in the mappings tab. And then once you have done the profile mappings, the next thing is you would want to provision users to your app, right? So then for that, you would go back to applications. Then you would click on the applications that you just created. And then this is where you would basically assign the different users that you want to create for this app. So what happens is once you set up, once you do the SAML setup here in Informatica would generate this Informatica SSO URL for you. And then all the end users would either use this URL or they could go to the Okta application catalog and then that just click on the checklist and automatically log into IICS, right? So who gets to log into this specific app is defined by who you add as users here under the application in Okta, right? So these are the different users that are currently assigned. The next one would be to assign these users. You can assign groups to this app. So all the users under this group will also have access to this specific app, right? So users and groups is something that you want to assign in your IICS side, right? The next one would be you can actually if you have already existing groups that you have created, you can actually push them also to IICS, right? So for example, let's try adding a new group here. I'm just adding a new test group here, right? And then I'm going to go back to applications. So, so right now I don't have the new group that I just created as part of my application, right? So if you go back to my admin here and then look at user groups, for example, I obviously wouldn't have something called as a webinar test group yet available here, right? So what I can do is I can click on push groups here and then just say webinar test group and then click on save. So what happens here is you can see that this group is actually getting pushed into IICS. So here I'm just going to refresh. Right now you don't see the webinar group, so I'm just going to click on refresh and then you would see the test group automatically pop in here. So you could do this for assigning some of these groups that you have on your identity provider side into IICS when you do the initial setup, right? And then the next setup would be is to start mapping the group information and assigning roles to it, right? So the first step that you would do here is you would first define what is the attribute that would have the group information in the SAML response, right? So if you remember, we created this the attribute as the group attribute that has to be sent back to IICS. Do you see this? It's called groups here. So we're going to say that groups is what the attribute name is, which will contain the group information of the specific user who logs in, right? So that's what is the SAML attribute mapping here. And then the next thing what you would do is assign the group to all these different roles, right? So you also see the out-of-the-box standard rules, and you also see the custom roles that you've created that you could assign the group into, right? So we actually created a group called webinar test group. So let's go ahead and map these here in the SAML setup. The one more thing that you could see here is this webinar test group currently does not have any roles assigned, right? Because we just pushed the group, but we didn't map the group here in the SAML setup. So what we're going to do is all the users who are part of this group are going to be a admin, right? So we're also going to make them say an admin and possibly, I'm just going to put a monitor group here. So once I do this mapping and save this, you can go back to the group here and you can see that they're automatically assigned the admin and the monitor role that we just configured, right? So if you again go back here and then map them to other roles, they'll automatically have those roles assigned as part of their user groups, right? So when they log in, the group information will say that they belong to that webinar test group, for example. And then once they log in, the group will automatically have these roles assigned. So they'll get the permissions according to whatever different role permissions that are assigned for admin and monitor and so on. So that's the next step for mapping these group variables. So we already saw we pushed the groups first, and then we also map the group mappings here, right? So then this is all that's enough for the initial setup from Okta. The next thing is, let's go ahead and create a folder in data integration, which is just assigned to this group, right? So let's go back folder here, and then I'm going to create a new project called webinar project. And then for this project, set the permissions for our webinar group, right? So you will see that here. So right now we would have, let's give all permissions to this group, to this project. I'm going to click on save. So anyone who logs in with this group will automatically have access to this project, right? So that's the idea. So the next thing that we do here is let's go to groups and then add the user to this group so that when we log in, we will have this group information, right? So I'm going to add myself to this group. I'm going to click on save, right? So I'm part of the webinar test group at this point. So let's go back here, copy this URL. I'm going to sign out. And then the next step I'm going to do is log into SSO. So it's taking into Okta and then signing me in directly. So now I am an Okta user signed in using the SSO authentication, right? So I'm going to click on data integration. We go to explore. And then click on this webinar project. I will have access to this folder, right? So I can pretty much whatever mappings or whatever, I can basically read them, right? So if I go back to my administrator, you can actually see that because I'm an admin, I can actually see what roles and groups that have been assigned to me. So I go to users. And if you look at this, I'm part of, say, this webinar test group also right now, right? So that's how I had access to the project folder here. So let's create a dummy mapping just for the permissions use case. And let's just save this. So I have access to this project because you can see that I'm able to create a mapping in this project. The mapping is currently saved here in this project folder. You can see here. So yeah, two mappings are created now. So the next thing is let's go back and change my profile to another group. And then let's try to log in again, right? So right. So right now I am already part of the admin group. Yeah, so let's try to log in again. And then we wouldn't be able to have access to the specific project folder. So I'm gonna go here and use the same SSO URL. I'm gonna log into data integration. Now I am I'm part of the admin user group. If I try to click on this, it'll still take me in, but I wouldn't have access, right? So this permissions dialog that you see is actually the same across the platform. So it's pretty much the user roles and the user group configuration is for all assets, be it schedules, be it connections, be it secure agents, be it any of these project folders. All of these uh, different assets in the platform will basically have the same permissions dialog that you could use. So the group information comes in from IDP, and you would automatically see that information propagated into the IICS platform, and wherever, whichever assets in the platform have this group assigned, will get you the access into that, right? So that's how the group information automatically is synced. And obviously, if, you saw the group moving example where I moved from one group to another group in the IDP side, and the permissions is automatically handled in the IICS platform. There's no manual intervention required, right? So that's one of the use cases that I want to show, and this kind of applies to all the assets that have permissions that you could set, right? The other information I want to quickly share is you would want to sometimes debug the SAML response with the group information, or what's the response that you get when you basically sign in with your identity provider, right? This is really useful for you to debug to make sure you're not missing any attributes and you have the right response that you expect from your identity provider side, right? So if you go back here, I'm going to just quickly log out and then bring my extension called SAML tracer. Again, this is there are multiple SAML tracers available, so you can use whatever is comfortable with you. The advantage here is you could actually see the SAML response when you sign into Informatica, right? So let's go ahead and try to trace this for our debugging purposes. So I'm going to sign in again with my SSO login, and you could see the SAML response here. So yeah, it's logged in. So let's pause this tracer here, and let's go to the first SAML response. So if you look at the SAML response, this is very similar to how the metadata XML that you have downloaded from Okta, right? So it has all the certificate information, it's got your user information, one email ID, and so on. And then the group is where you would be really interested in, right? So you remember I did a dot star on my group from Okta. So I get all the group information that's that I'm part of from Okta, right? So this is the group attributes that I was talking about. And if you have any other attributes that you send, you'll also see that information here. So this is a very, very useful tool for you to understand what's the group that's coming in into IICS, what's the username that's coming into IICS. Like you can see the email address that Okta responds through SAML. And this is pretty effective for you to debug initially to figure out if there is any kind of configuration that's missing in your Okta side, right? So this is something I want to quickly share, even though this is not very specific to SCIM. This is a very useful tool that you could use for anything that's got to do with SAML and SCIM, right? But yeah, to quickly summarize, you would you can have users and groups sync with synced up from your identity provider to your service provider. You can also map multiple groups in your Informatica side, assign those rules automatically, and whichever assets in the IICS platforms are assigned that group, they are automatically given permissions once you log in, as long as you're part of the group, right? And the setup that we just did here for Okta, this could be very similar that you would see for Azure AD, for example. And the other major information is about the profile mappings, which is like a big list of profile attributes that IICS expects, which again you can get it from our doc site for the full list, and then map it here in the profile, right? So that's been a quick introduction to what this new feature is about and what Informatica supports from an SCIM standpoint. Hope you enjoyed this webinar, and if you have any questions, please feel free to post them here, and we'll be happy to help. See you soon again in the next webinar, and have a good day. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. If you have any queries, please post them in the box. We'll try and answer them. Also, just wanted to call out that this session is being recorded and will be available in the Informatica Support YouTube channel and the Success Portal. From the Success Portal Tech Tuesdays page, you'll also be able to download the slide deck. Also, there is a post-webinar survey. Please put in your feedbacks and suggestions, and if you have any suggestions for upcoming topics, please let us know through that. Over to you, Sriram. There is one question from Amit. Can we answer that question?
Yep. Thanks, Linda. So I guess let me look at the question. So in IDP, while doing user profile mapping, there's a tab named IICS to Okta. What this means and what it does. So so we did see user attributes that's getting mapped from Okta to IICS, right? So that could also be two-way sync from the service provider into Okta if required. So I think the mappings that you saw is actually for those changes to be synced on the other side. So again, there's a list of mappings that you'll have to do for both ways. So it's a two-way sync there. There's another question from Nicholas. Are both roles and groups mapping required in SAML setup, or we could just choose to map only groups, for instance? So you could actually just do groups if all your users are part of groups. If there are users for some reason who are not part of a group, but you still want to do some, you can still push roles separately for those non-group users. You could still do SAML role mapping if required. But if you already have the users as part of some groups, I think you should that should be fine. You don't have to do roles specifically. Thanks for
Thank you, Sriram. Let's speak to one more time.
Check.
Yeah, we got another question from Amit.
Oh yeah, sure. Before I kind of jump onto the question, the quick thing I have to clarify is, so when we start off the webinar, we mentioned that the first thing that you have to enable is your enabling SCIM and then the generate token, right? That's assuming that you have the SAML setup already provisioned in your IICS platform, right? If you don't have SAML setup at all, just as I mentioned in the demo, you go through the SAML setup first and then enable SCIM after that. Okay, I just thought I'd clarify that in case you had a question on that. So the question next from Amit is, can we use IDP only for auth and manage authorization in IICS? It's possible. Yes, definitely it's possible. You can just use it for authentication alone. That's the default SAML setup that you can configure. And if you don't have that enable IDP to push groups through SCIM, then you don't basically do group wrapping. So you can use either for authorization alone or for authorization and user group sync. So you have both these options. All right, next go to the next one. So Nicholas, we're using AAD and we have hundreds of groups. It seems difficult to map all these groups in the setting. Should we decrease the number of groups to map with IICS? So yeah, it definitely makes sense to figure out why you have hundreds of groups if they all form. If they have their own distinct set of roles, for example, you'll have to probably do a cleanup process there. But given the scenario that you still have, a large number of groups, you still have to come here and map it at least as a one-time setup, right? But yeah, if you think there's a cleanup required, maybe it was just amended over the course of time. You might want to just create a new bucket and then have them have the total group list lesser than what it is currently. So right. Hey, Vrinda, quickly checking. Are you able to hear me when I'm answering these?
Yes, I can hear you, Sriram.
All right, thank you. Next one is from Srini. please provide the path to the setup docs you've mentioned. Definitely. So, Vrinda, what would be the right way to post the doc link here?
So we can do one thing. We can update the links that you have mentioned or docs that you have mentioned in the slide deck, and we can upload that one in the Success Portal. We can do that.
Sure. Okay, awesome. Yeah. So
Okay.
Srini, I think we'll just update the slide and
deck.
you should see the update in the doc portal, right?
Yeah, we can do that.
All right. Yep. Next one again, it's from Amit. If we have more than one org, one for prod, one for sandbox, yes. So how this works is from your IDP side, nothing is going to change. You're going to use the same credentials for logging into IICS, right? But if you remember this, once you set up the SAML in admin console for dev and QA or product, whatever, you get a unique URL, right? So there'll be 3 different applications. Say if it's dev, QA, prod, you'll have 3 different applications in your Octa site, and you have 3 different SSO URLs that you can log in into. So as I mentioned again in the demo, your end users can log in directly through that URL, or they can just log in, go to their Octa homepage, and then click on that IICS dev, chiclet, or QA or prod app separately, right? The other follow-up that would be it'll be interesting for you guys is when you have a multi app setup, given that usernames are distinct within a pod. So when I say pod, NA1, NA2, NA3 are different pods, for example, right? And you can have your dev, QA, and prod all belonging to the same tenant, and that will be the most common scenario, right? And if you have already noticed this, within the same tenant, you can't have duplicate usernames for obvious reasons. So how does username get handled, right? So we kind of handled it behind the scenes. So when you have multiple applications pointing to the same tenant, for example, we will automatically just sequence it as .saml, .saml1, .2, and so on. So we'll handle that username distinct scenario behind the scenes. You don't have to worry about it. But yeah, you just have to configure different applications in your IDP site, and you'll get different URLs, obviously, for each of those orgs in Informatica site, right? So yeah, that'll kind of handle that scenario.
Thank you, Sriram. Please post your questions if you have any. We have some more time before we end the session.
Yeah, thanks, Amit. Any other questions from other folks?
There is one question from Venkata. Yeah.
Yep.
Please go ahead.
So yeah, so the question is how to take back users and groups. So I'm assuming how to revoke access if I'm right. But yeah, Venkat, let me know in a follow-up question if my assumption is wrong. But revoking access is pretty straightforward and it can be handled in your IDP side, right? First is as you saw, if you have to restrict access or revoke access, you just remove them from the groups, right? So that's one way of doing it. The second way, that's for the groups, right? The second thing is for users itself. So how things work in the IDP world is once you assign the user to an application, they get to log in with their Okta credentials or whatever Active Directory Okta is integrated with, right? So if they are not active users for that application, they pretty much wouldn't have access. So what happens is if you just use the URL and then go to the browser and hit enter, when it redirects to Okta, you enter your username, password, and Okta will know that this user is not assigned to this app, so I'm not going to authorize you. I'm not going to let you into the applications, and Informatica will receive a non-authenticated response from Okta, so we won't let them in, right? And obviously, Informatica will not also know, even if hypothetically you let them in, there's no group information, there's no other information that the Okta would have sent, so it's pretty much you can't basically log into the application. So there's a follow-up there. How to know my current state and something goes wrong, how to restore to previous state with respective users and groups. Venkat, I think I probably need more information on that. So what do you mean by current state and going back to the previous state? So whatever state, again, I'm thinking that you're moving between groups, for example, that's probably a state that you consider. But all of this is again happening on the IDP side. Informatica just blindly reads what Okta or Azure AD is going to send, but the maintenance and administrative work will still happen on the IDP side, right? But yeah, if you have any more information, please let us know as a follow-up question. I'm not pretty sure what. Okay, how many users and groups I have now? So you could get that in the admin console. So if you go to users, you pretty much have the list of users that you see in the admin console. And once you go into the users, it will also tell you if this user is a SSO user or a native user, right? So you can get that number, you can get that list from the admin console, and same holds good with groups. Where if it's synced from the IDP, you can see those groups there. And you also get to see the native groups, right? So the list that you see in the admin console would be a superset of both native users / groups and native, and SAML users / groups. So it's both, right? So it's an overall list. Is there any other enhancement related to SCIM integration on the roadmap? Like, for example, you say that, you saw that the password is obviously not something that we support. The password sync, for example, is not something that we support right now, right? But as of now, if you have any suggestions, please do let us know. This is like probably the first major version of the SCIM integration, right? So we would definitely be happy to hear your feedback and ideas. And there are some new features that are coming in as part of the backlog. If you have any ideas, please post them on network, and definitely we can take those ideas to the product team and then have them implemented in the next releases. But yeah, with IICS, you would see new releases coming in either monthly or either major releases, and yeah, once you give more feedback, we'll definitely try to implement them in our releases. Is there an alert mechanism to administrator if new users or groups are added in the SSO side? I don't believe we have one from the admin console for sure. Let me see. We have to check back on the operation insight stuff if we have a report or an alert mechanism for new users or groups. But yeah, at least from the admin console, we don't have anything at this point. Thanks, Venkat, for your questions. Yep. Please let us know if you have more questions. So Venkata has a question. The security risks, the IICS admin will not know who's getting added and deleted. Yeah, that's true. So the IICS admin would definitely work with the IDP admins, for example, because the IDP admin, when they're configuring a user, right? So let's take an example with respect to security risks, right? So there's a new user who joins the organization, for example, and then when the new user joins in, the IDP, obviously they'll just set them up on Okta, and if they're going to be an Informatica admin or developer or whatever, right? I assume there's going to be some process behind the scenes where they'll have a sync with the IICS admin and let them know what roles or groups should they be added into in the Okta side, right? So that process should be there in place when a new user comes in. I hope the identity provider team does not just give a IICS admin group attached to any new user that just joins the organization, right? So it's mostly a process change, if not already, that the IICS admin and the IDP admin should be in sync there, right? But yeah, without that, if everyone who joins the organization by default gets added to the IICS group, obviously they'll have access, right? So and most of the cases, the IDP teams would have a better access control than just giving a gate pass to pretty much all the applications in the org, right? So mostly that could be handled, but yeah, Venkata, let us know in case there's any other process that you think that this would pose a security risk for.
Thank you, Sriram. Let's wait for some more time. If you do not have any questions in a minute or so, we'll end the session.
All right, I think Brenda, I don't
Yeah,
guess we have
looks
any
like
more questions. Yep.
Yeah, looks like we don't have any more questions coming in. Hope we have answered all your questions. If I have failed to answer any of your questions, we'll get back to you. We'll try to get back to you right after this session. Thanks a lot for joining. Also, thanks Sriram, Shiv, and Prashant for this wonderful session and being the panelists, answering the questions, everything. Thanks a lot. Everyone, you can stay updated with the new webinars that are coming up in the Success Portal, in the Tech Tuesdays page itself. We will post more webinars there. Thank you for joining. See you on our next Tech Tuesdays webinar. Thank you. Bye.